Welcome to the latest episode of GrowthChat. Today, we are very happy to have Melissa Dell with us. She is professor of economics at Harvard University, and last year she was the recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal. And very welcome from Melbourne. Hi, Melissa.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Yeah. Today we will be talking about your paper, the persistent effect of Peru's mining Mita, which you published in 2010 in Econometrica. And maybe to get us going, we could first tell us a bit of what are the mining Mita? What should we think about them?
So the mining Mita is essentially when you hear about Spain taking lots and lots of silver from the New World and bringing it back to Europe and it causing massive inflation and everything, most of that silver came from the mines in Peru. So the Spanish discovered large silver mines there. They weren't able to work it with free labor, at least not being able to make the profit that they would want. And so instead, they used forced indigenous labor. And so communities in highland Peru and Bolivia were required to send 1/7 of their adult male population each year to work in the mines. And the Mita was that labor draft that required them to send men to work in the mines.
Wonderful. Now, what your paper is all about is not economic history per se, that you talk about how that mining system worked, but you find that historic system still has impact on today's living standards. Could you maybe tell us what the main results are?
So I compare nearby places that look similar in every in every respect that we're able to measure in terms of their pre-characteristics. So their geography looks similar. The limited data we have before the Mita was implemented looks similar. But places on one side of this boundary were required to send labor to the mines, whereas places on the other side weren't, essentially because once they had enough labor, they didn't need to go through the costs of forcing even more labor to come work in the mines. And so you can compare these nearby villages. Some were subjected to this forced labor draft for about 240 years. The other nearby places weren't. And what I find is the places that were subjected to the forced labor draft are poorer today. So they have lower consumption. Children are more likely to be malnourished. And in particular, people are more likely to be subsistence farmers. And you very much kind of notice these differences on the ground. And so I went there and kind of traveled around. And the first thing I noticed was that the Mita districts were very difficult to get to. To the non-Mita districts, I could take a bus on a road and you could get there. The Mita districts, you'd be in a van and there's no paved road to speak of. And it was very difficult to get to these places. And they were also totally shocked that anybody, an American would try to come and show up and go there. And so, in the paper, I argue that is a central part of the mechanism, that these places that were subjected to forced labor, they're poorer today. They're poorer today because they're more likely to be subsistence farmers. And the reason for that is they don't have the public goods that they need to be able to take their crops and get them to market. And so then that raises the question, well, what does this have anything, to do with forced labor hundreds of years ago? We see these stark economic differences today, but what's the connection? And so I think that's the really interesting part where a lot of the history comes in. One thing that I realized just in doing a lot of reading from historians and trying to understand, well, what else did the Mita impact at the time that it was in force? They talk about how, the Spanish had, a challenging time administering this labor draft. There are a limited number of outsiders who came over and tried to conquer this place that they're not familiar with. They have a lot of, difficulties making things go their way. They want to extract resources, but that's a challenging task. And in particular, one thing that made it challenging is that Spanish settlers come over and they want to extract resources too. And so the Spanish colonial state, like realizing that Spanish settlers who came over would be competition for labor, did not by and large let the Spanish settlers settle in the areas where they wanted to use the forced labor in the mines. The king wanted that labor, for himself to extract the silver. And of course, if you let Spanish settlers go to that area, when somebody comes around and says, okay, now we need 1/7 of the population here because they're going to go to the mines and work for the king, the landowner is not going to cooperate with that. He's probably armed. It's not going to work. And so essentially they just, the crown gave land grants to Spanish settlers for areas outside of this forced labor draft, but not inside. And that persists throughout the 240 years that this is in force. And so then you flash forward to independence. The Mita has been abolished, and you still see that the Hispanic settlers, the largest states, they're in the areas outside this forced labor draft and not the areas where it had been in force. Now, once there's independence, there's no more Mita. There's no longer, the government, doesn't have an incentive to keep Spanish settlers out. And in fact, they do try to go into these areas and essentially take land because the indigenous people there, their rights aren't really appreciated or respected by the state historically. And the government is essentially fine with Spanish settlers coming in and trying to grab the land. But by this point, population, which collapsed during the colonial period, has recovered. There's a lot of people there who aren't just going to willingly give up their land. So that leads to conflict. And the people who are trying to go in and grab the land, they're not fully successful. So you can go all the way forward to the 20th century, and you see that the large estates, which originated with these Spanish settlers going way back to the early colonial period, they're still disproportionately in the areas that are outside. And because that's where kind of the large landowners are, they're able to get the roads. You get genuine land reform like in the 1970s. So now there's not large landowners in any of these places either, but the roads are still there. And there hasn't been a huge amount of infrastructure investment recently. And so there's just, essentially land is very persistent. Where you put infrastructure is very persistent. And so once it goes there, it changes at best very slowly, if at all. And, once you have that infrastructure there, you can take away all the large landowners, but whoever is there now is going to benefit from that. And whoever didn't get it, well, they're out of luck unless the state goes in and makes new investments.
It is very fascinating how something that happened centuries ago still have an impact today. So you answered the question about what are the channels of persistence, and now I'm curious to know what kind of data did you use and where did you find it?
So a combination of different sources, and so a lot of it came from different historical sources. There's a great library in Cusco that tries to collect all the things that have ever been written about the region. And so going there was really fruitful. Some stuff is modern data collected by the Peruvian Statistics Agency, in which case, I just kind of showed up and knocked on the door, which is also oftentimes in these sort of contexts, I guess, especially at the time I was working on this paper, the best way to actually get the data. Of course, now a lot of places will put that sort of data online, but that was less true at the time. So I think, essentially a combination of, going to this library in the region that had lots of documents and going around to the statistics agency and saying, hey, I need this data set.
What do you find exciting about this line of research? So that's the intersection between growth, history, development. So yeah, I'm curious, what do you find challenging and exciting at the same time?
Yeah, so I think that when I went into writing this paper, I was just, super curious whether this idea of extractive institutions being responsible, at least in part, for poor long-run growth performance, which was popularized by Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, whether this really had any bite to it, because of course you do have the reaction, well, it was like, it was hundreds of years ago. At the same time, we can easily see how things can be incredibly persistent. And so, I wanted to look at this particular example because it is like the quintessential example of colonial exploitation. You take people, you make them work in mines and horrible conditions, so you can extract like large amounts of resources. And so it was just, I think it was exciting to have an opportunity to kind of take, this big picture idea that there's, that there's some evidence for in the cross-country data, and really drill down and say, well, in this case where if this theory was true, we would kind of really expect to see it here. Is this what we see? And it was great to read the historical literature. I think oftentimes you have an appreciation that things are kind of more complex than what you might come into it with. And so, like, yes, there is this persistence, but not so much the conventional view that, like, okay, well then, the state government doesn't protect, the national government doesn't protect property rights, et cetera. There's kind of this more kind of complex, chain of persistence, right? And so that's really fun to delve into. I think the challenging part is just largely finding the data you need and being patient. I had to type a lot of data in, which wasn't the most fun thing in the world, but there's no way around that if you want to understand what it says.
Yeah, wonderful. I've been a big fan of that paper for a long time, and also like the fact how you bring together top-notch econometrics, economic history, and narrative, and all that weave together in a wonderful way. Now, something more personal. So if you go back to your high school days, were you always keen to become a social scientist or even an economist, or did you have other plans originally?
I'm not sure I knew what a social scientist was in high school, to be honest. I didn't grow up in a place around a university or things like that where it would have even sort of crossed my mind. I think obviously when I came to college, I had an appreciation that this was something that some people did. But I think what really made me interested in it was writing a senior thesis. I got some kind of introduction to what doing research is actually like. And then this paper, which was my master's thesis, I got to kind of really delve into it, and I really enjoyed that. And so I think it was just actually kind of that process of, of doing research myself. And it was just this really cool way, I think, to be able to marry long-standing interests I'd had, so I loved reading books as a kid. I'd read James Michener, right, which is in some sense, he'd talk about a lot of these kind of very long-run phenomenon, things like that. But I also liked programming my TI-83 calculator, right? And so economics is just this really cool, I think it's a really cool field in that it allows us to kind of combine things that are very qualitative and read historians who kind of go in and try to understand every detail of everything, but aren't necessarily bringing quantitative evidence to the table. And you can combine that with math and super technical things, and that all kind of lives in this space. And so I just I loved how it allowed you to bring all those kind of different ways of thinking together.
So how do you come to pick topics or countries to study? Because you've also done work on Asia and not just South America. So how come?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of this paper, when I was an undergrad, I had spent a summer in Peru, and I was working in microfinance. And so I kind of knew the region and knew people in the region and knew a little bit about the history. And so that was kind of what I think drew me to this specific example. But I also think to the extent that it's feasible, like it's also really rewarding to study multiple contexts, because you realize that like certain assumptions you might have about the way the world works because you focused on this one particular context, when you go to some totally different context, that just, it completely falls apart. I think for a long time, I've been interested in the contrast between Latin America and Asia, and how if you go back, to the early 20th century, if anything, East Asia is the place that's poor, and then they grow remarkably fast, and Latin America essentially kind of stagnates, at least to a much greater extent than much of East Asia. So why is that the case? And I don't think I've ever really done that much to answer that question, but it's still something that I'm working on. A lot of it is, going back to what's the challenges, like data availability. There's a lot of data out there that could shed light on that. That's all in hard copy. And I wouldn't find somebody with the skills to type that in by hand. When you go to the historical Asian context, they use all these characters that only a historian can recognize, right? And so there's just a lot of data challenges, but that's been something I've been really focused on lately, is deep learning methods for curating data to get around some of those challenges, to be able to look at kind of things in a broader, more comparative perspective, which is again fun because I get to combine learning about the history of the region, essentially with math, which is what being able to do automated data curation is about, using a mathematical model that will accurately convert, images of data into actual data that you can work with in, for running regressions.
So of all the things you are currently working on, what are you most excited about? So what is it that we should look forward to reading in the next few months?
Well, the one thing that I've been super excited about, which maybe sounds atypical coming from an economist, but a consistent stumbling block to, looking at the questions that I want to look at again, is just getting the data into a format that can be used, because it can be really vast. For a lot of the questions I'm interested in, it's kind of necessary to have individual level data, right? If you want to think about misallocation across firms or inequality, opportunity, all those things, you really can't do that very well with aggregated data. But dealing with data entry firms is a pain. Oftentimes it's just not feasible for the scale of the data. And so, last spring, we released a package based on a ton of work we've been doing for the past couple of years that recognizes complex layouts in documents, which helps a lot with automated digitization. But it still doesn't necessarily get you all the way there, because you also need to actually digitize the characters themselves. And so we can understand the layouts of documents and which pieces of the document, refer to what type of information, but we also need really accurate digitizations of characters to do a lot of things that I'm interested in, like just digitizing lots of numbers, but also names, tracking people across time, etc. And no commercial OCR product provides that. And essentially, commercial OCR is not designed to let you be able to take the model and fine tune it to your context. It's not going to work because of the way that they've designed the underlying model, which is just using kind of a model architecture, a type of neural network that is not conducive to doing that. And so, I've been working with a couple of pre-docs who are amazing in developing a totally new architecture for OCR, which is great in low resource settings. And so essentially we can take a limited number of labels, because you need labels for the model to learn things, and fine tune OCR to our context. And we're seeing things over 99% accuracy, digitizing historical Japanese, which is a language that has 11,000 characters. And so it finally seems like I've been kind of OCR has been my Achilles heel for years, just because it's just never really good enough to do what I needed it to do. And I feel finally, we have our sort of custom solution. We're working on getting that all written up and illustrating that it works. And, as soon as we're able to, we'll also release like a Python package that makes it easier for other people to implement. So that's actually what I'm super excited about. It's not like an economics paper, but I'm hoping that it will open the door to interesting economics papers that would have been just impossible or too annoying to write otherwise.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, we had the chance some weeks ago to see you present the layout parser and your ongoing work on that. So amazing. No, thank you so much, Melissa. That was a ride through history and ending in computer vision in the year 2021, cutting edge work also on the methodological front. So we had all of that today in 20 minutes. Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful evening in Boston, and hope to see you again face to face sometime next year.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sascha, for running the interview. I'll see you at the next one.